Welcome to the Becoming SuperHuman Podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to bring you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
This episode is brought to you by Organifi. You know, the one thing that literally every single diet and nutrition expert that we've had on the show seems to agree on is that we need to eat more veg and get our greens and consume all natural products. But let's be honest. How many of us actually have the time? Well, recently I had the opportunity to meet some of the folks over at Organifi, and I've been absolutely blown away by them and their product. You see, Organifi is an organic superfood green juice powder that literally covers all your nutritional bases without having to eat 5 bowls of kale. It saves you loads of time, loads of money, and a lot of chewing. And really all you have to do is add water and drink it. So to check it out and save an incredible 20% off your first order, visit Organifi.com. That's Organifi.com and use coupon code SuperHuman at checkout. Greetings, SuperFriends, and welcome to a very special episode of the Becoming SuperHuman Podcast, our 100th episode. Can you guys believe that it has been 100 episodes? You guys, when I first started out, I actually wasn't sure if I was going to make it to 10. And when I listened back to the first few episodes, the absolutely cringeworthy performance that I gave makes it all the more impressive that you guys have stuck with me this far. Now, for our 100th episode, I really wanted to do something just a little bit special. And you see, at the very beginning of every episode, we promise to give you guys the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And I think for the most part that we deliver on that promise every single week. Though with 100 episodes, it can be hard to keep track of all the takeaways that we've offered on the show. Even I, who records the episodes and then listens to them again after they've been edited, I can lose sight of all the little hidden gems that come out over the course of time. So that's why, guys, for this episode, I want to revisit each and every episode, and I want to offer you the top 1 to 2 takeaways that I personally remember from each one. I'll then tell you why I think that episode was important and how it's affected my life. And at the end, I want to let you know my top 10 favorite episodes and the top 10 books that guests have recommended to me. Let me say, guys, that this was quite easily the most difficult, grueling episode we've ever had to produce. I spent countless hours over the last few months digging through all of the incredible ideas, quotes, books, talking points, and takeaways that we've shared over the last 2 incredible years. And even with speed reading and memory techniques, it was a hell of a lot of information to go through. So ultimately, a lot of major stuff had to be left out. Now, for this reason, I want to encourage you guys to check out and listen to or re-listen to any episode that piques your interest during this summary review episode. You just might want to listen to this one, in fact, with a pen and paper in hand. So either way, I hope you enjoy this very condensed summary and that you catch a few things that you either didn't know or recall a few things that maybe you'd forgotten over the last year or two. I know I did, and I know I got so much out of revisiting all the wisdom that our guests had to share. Now, guys, before we dig into it, I want to tell you about a very special raffle that we're holding. We're actually going to be giving away one Valky human charger biohacking device to one lucky listener. Now, you might remember the human charger from episode number 57, where we talked about transcranial light therapy and its benefits. This giveaway is valued at $199, guys, and all you have to do to be eligible is leave us a review on iTunes and then email us a screenshot of that published review along with your mailing address to info at becomingasuperhuman.com, and we will announce the winner of that raffle on our social media channels in the next 2 weeks. So don't delay on that one. And now, without any further ado, I'm proud to present to you my top takeaways from episode number ... Episode number 1, Dr. Lev and Anna Goldentouch. In this very first episode, guys, I learned that interviewing people is not as easy as you might think, especially in echoey rooms. A problem that, as you can tell, I've finally solved. Just kidding, but while the episode did offer a nice review of some of the tangential topics related to superlearning, the big takeaways here were that I was still finding out what the podcast was going to be, and I really wanted to make it something different and explore topics different from what I cover in my superlearning courses. Episode number 2, Erwin LaCour. In this episode, I interviewed someone who takes a very functional and paleo-esque approach to fitness. My favorite point in the entire episode was the idea that most modern humans don't even know how to use their own bodies. I loved Erwin's idea that we are not fragmented beings and that therefore our workout regimens should be not fragmented. Overall, his movement, pun intended here, towards a more natural lifestyle and exercise culture were inspiring to me because, as he said, quote, "The world really needs people who are freaking happy and healthy and full of life." You said it, brother. Episode 3, Dr. Anthony Metivier. Obviously, the biggest takeaway, if you will, from this episode is that Anthony and I became very, very close friends and colleagues. However, on a more granular level, this episode completely changed my opinion of memory palaces and where they fit into mnemonic techniques as a whole. I retooled my teaching significantly based on Anthony's recommendation, placing more emphasis on memory palaces and a greater emphasis on the field of mnemonics as a whole. Beyond that, Anthony's influence on me as a mentor and a friend has touched nearly every aspect of my life, both personally and professionally. And so, all in all, a pretty solid outcome for a podcast episode. Episode number 4, Yuri Marmerstein. In this episode, I learned that you really don't need to be a classically trained gymnast to do amazing things with your body. After the interview, I started messing around with gymnastics more seriously, and I was amazed at what I could accomplish with just a little bit of practice. My other big takeaway was that the most amazing things are usually the easiest, whereas the most difficult things you can do with the human body are usually not that impressive to onlookers. Episode number 5, Nelson Dellis. The first time I spoke with Nelson, I gained a deep insight into the world of the competitive memory athlete, and I learned that discipline in one sport transfers into every other. Ironically, the nitty-gritty of what memory techniques are being used in the World Championships were not even close to the most interesting things uncovered in that episode. Instead, what I found so interesting was the discipline and regimentation that has made Nelson a 4-time champion and an accomplished mountain climber. Also, perhaps one of the best outcomes of the episode was the in-depth interview that Nelson later honored our masterclass students with, which to this day is one of the most watched lectures in the masterclass. Episode 6, Benny Lewis. Many of you know that I include Benny's TED Talk on learning languages in my online courses, and for good reason. In both the TED Talk and the interview, I very much enjoyed Benny's carefree, approachable, and fun take on learning languages. My big takeaway here was the system that Benny uses to determine where to focus during his learning journey. You see, rather than systematizing or following formulas, Benny takes an ad hoc approach, attempting to speak and then assessing his weak spots on the fly, which was a big awakening for me. Of course, his other tips on learning grammar and vocabulary were equally worthwhile, so if you haven't heard that episode, you should definitely check it out. Episode 7, Dr. Andrew Hill. This was the first episode we did on nootropics. Despite the fact that I've always been extremely interested in them, there were a few huge takeaways that have actually changed the way I live my life. The first was that tea is a better nootropic than coffee due to naturally high levels of L-theanine. Another takeaway was that meditation can actually change the brain, but only if it's done every single day. Finally, this episode reinforced my beliefs on a high-fat, low-carb diet, and it changed my opinions on what time to wake up, as well as how to do it. Episode 8, Ryan Demon Ford. To be honest, I didn't know what to think about parkour before doing this episode, but I'm really glad that I did it. What was most fascinating to me was the way that Ryan looks at the world around him and where his body fits into it. Though I haven't had a chance to experiment with parkour, it's still definitely on my to-do list. Episode 9, Adir Rotem. In this episode, I gained an understanding of what it actually means to be the best in the world at something and the sacrifices that it takes to get there. Just seeing the mindset and the determination, the refusal to give up as evidenced by every turn in Adir's story really opened up my eyes. Beyond that though, my biggest takeaway was this quote: "Hard work beats talent. Talent isn't enough. You still need to work hard. But if you've got talent and you're a hard worker, this is really dangerous. Watch out." Episode 10, Jennifer Cassetta. I had an incredible rapport with Jennifer during this episode and really started to feel the difference that having 9 interviews under my belt made. The conversation really flowed much more smoothly, and we managed to get a couple big takeaways, most specifically, how to avoid dangerous and compromising situations. More specifically, I loved how Jennifer's work on self-defense wasn't just against violent incidents, but also defending yourself from unhealthy emotional patterns and interactions. Episode 11, Manish Sethi. Like so many of Tim Ferriss's personal friends, Manish is an absolutely out there guy, and every time I chat with him or run into him, I'm reminded of that. Perhaps one of the most out there views he shared was that we can hack our brains into breaking habits within days, not weeks or months. He definitely surprised me with his knowledge of neuroscience, and that made me realize that his company is about much more than shock therapy for retaining habits. Episode 12, Chad Foreman. This was the first episode where we really went into meditation. In it, I really shifted the way that I think about meditation. First and foremost, I realized that, as Chad said, quote, "The thoughts will always be there. It's just a new relationship you have with thoughts," end quote. Additionally, this episode opened up my eyes to the idea that meditation is a gift and an offering that you give the world, and that if we all meditated more, the world would be a collectively better place. If you're not already meditating, definitely listen to this episode and please get started today. Episode 13, Diane Fu. I love Diane. She and I totally hit it off during the interview, and I've since flown across the world to have my butt kicked by her. In the episode, I took away the wonderful quote that mobility is life. If you're not moving, you're probably dead. But perhaps more surprising was Diane's humility and her thoughts on ego. As the literal poster woman for perfect movements and mobility, with her face on the walls of most CrossFit gyms around the world, it would be pretty easy for her to have a big ego. And yet, her biggest message was that we should always check our own egos, lest someone else come along and check them for us. In her words, quote, "Nothing is more blinding than a person's ego," end quote. Wise, wise words. Episode 14, Louis Congdon. I'd be lying if I said that I immediately saw the fit of having a love and relationship expert on a show about, well, becoming superhuman, but I'm really glad I did. First and foremost, the episode opened my eyes a bit to the possibilities of what I could do with the show and where I could take it. And it helped me realize that I could really focus on any area of the human experience, not just fitness and memory. I'd later open the door for some of the most successful episodes on productivity, networking, and much, much more. As far as episode-specific takeaways go, I learned that having a healthy relationship with another human can actually dramatically improve your health. I also learned that a little bit about how to properly search for and choose the right romantic partner. Namely, that the tactics you use to get into a relationship are the same ones you use to stay in one. Admittedly, I haven't been as successful in implementing that takeaway as I would have liked, but hey, that's neither here nor there. Episode 15, Vanessa Van Edwards. I've studied body language quite a bit in my life, using it to become a more confident speaker and to improve the way others perceive me. So I already knew that we can, in fact, learn to become, quote, alphas. I also knew that I should stand during phone calls and interviews, that my testosterone would increase if I did some power poses, and I even knew that we can change the way others perceive us just by changing our body language. And yet, I ended up learning a whole bunch of new things from Vanessa. First, I learned that we have 3 windows in our body, and we need to monitor what we're doing in each of them at all times. I also learned some of the big takeaways that Vanessa has learned by studying alphas, and some of the reproducible elements of what people call charisma. One of the big takeaways for me was realizing that people who are successful in captivating the public eye almost always have impeccable body language skills. And this has definitely been an important aspect of my ability to do things like a TEDx talk or create more successful courses, be interviewed in major media outlets, and so on. Episode 16, Carl Paoli. You would expect that the biggest takeaway from an expert on human movement and gymnastics would be something to do with the body. And sure, there were a few of those, like Carl's assessment that burpees, quote, contain the meaning of life, end quote, or the idea that literally any skill you learn is transferable into another area of your life, or the teacher-to-teacher tip that people really need concrete formulas to learn effectively. However, the biggest takeaway for me came at the end of the episode. Carl talked a bit about the legacy that he wants to leave and how he wants to be remembered, but then reiterated his comments earlier in the episode that in order to do good in the world, he has to first put himself and his family in a stable, healthy, and happy position. I think so many entrepreneurs and nonprofit workers want to do good in the world and set out to do that first and foremost, but Carl's point really left a mark on me. If I want to help others, I need to first make sure that I'm in the position to give help and love and support. And since that episode, I've focused more on my own health and happiness. And as a result, I've been able to give much more to my friends, my family, and my audience. Episode 17, Peter C. Brown. Before this, I had had some memory experts on the show, but never someone who was an expert on learning from a clinical background. It was really great to compare notes and find out that cutting-edge research agreed with so much of what I'd been teaching in my Superlearner course for years. Things like spaced repetition, linking memories, visual mnemonic techniques, and learning by doing. However, one big takeaway that jumps out in my mind was the one that disagreed most with my, quote, shortcut mentality to hacking learning up until that point. Quote, when learning is easy, it doesn't stick, end quote. Because of this one line, I've altered and improved the way that I teach and talk about accelerated learning, emphasizing that struggling with problems and getting stuck is actually an important part of the learning process, something that I never really understood before. Episode 18, Mitch Matthews. The biggest message in this episode for me was the idea that most of us simply aren't dreaming big enough. This episode was recorded back before I had fully formed my thoughts on the power of abundance thinking versus scarcity thinking, and I think this episode was a part of that process. Since then, I've come to realize that we all carry around a lot of limiting beliefs, and we put boundaries and bookends on our dreams for no reason. If you can't dream it, you can't do it, and most of us preclude the amazing from happening before the very first action step. So the big takeaway, dream bigger. Episode 19, The Complete Beginner's Guide to Passive Income. Well, it would be hard to say I learned much from this episode as I wrote and delivered it without a guest. In it, I went into depth sharing everything I know about passive income from the perspective of economic theory all the way up to the actual mechanisms that make it possible. I guess that my biggest takeaway here after reading the emails and comments was how much you guys enjoyed it and that I should really experiment more with different formats once in a while. Episode 20, Emil Grafstra. In this episode, my mind was opened to a whole new direction that the future could and probably will take: implantable technology. I've always joked that I would love to have a barcode on my wrist with all my credit cards and IDs, but that's basic compared to what's actually being done by more and more people. Emil pulled back the kimono on an exciting new world of possibilities where you can unlock doors with the wave of a hand, pay for dinner without carrying anything in your pockets, and more. The best part? All of these implants are already available, affordable, and take only a few minutes to, quote, install in your body. Episode 21, Tayo Roxon. Over the last 2 years, you've probably heard me talk a lot about the idea that we each have a unique gift, something that we can share with and contribute to the world that nobody else can. Though that's a very big part of the ideology behind a lot of great thinkers, including Tony Robbins, I think I was first really exposed to it by Tayo Roxon. Tayo offers a friendly and accessible approach to motivating and inspiring people to discover what their difference is and how they can use that difference to make a difference. It's definitely helped me refine the narrative I tell about the work I do, further leveraging my own unique history to help me connect with others who struggle the way I did. Episode 22, John Michael Morgan. One of my big challenges in life up until this point has been learning to lead others, and this episode was among the biggest factors in helping surmount it. John cuts away all the fat and hype from leadership thinking, and he gets to the straight dope. He echoes a really great idea that's come up quite a few times in the show since, the idea that in order to achieve something, you have to become the kind of person that logically achieves it. Ultimately, though, the biggest takeaway for me was a book that John pointed me to that I'd actually never heard of before, and that book was The E-Myth Revisited. And it so rocked my world and impacted my businesses that I've recommended it to every entrepreneur I've talked to since. Episode 23, Rory Vaden. This episode was chock full of frameworks, new terminology, and processes. Rory is really good at applying names and models to concepts that we've all experienced, which I really appreciate. Rory also talks about the difference between changing simple behaviors versus changing the underlying beliefs and much, much more. But if I had to choose one big takeaway from the episode, it's the idea of just procrastinating on purpose, as the title of Rory's book suggests. You see, since meeting Rory, I've stopped feeling guilty about procrastinating, delegating, or just refusing to do things that I don't want to or am not competent enough to do. I really like the idea that I know what I actually need to be doing to create more time and have more success, and simply removing the guilt around that has been phenomenal. Also, Rory's closing quote was so good that it bears repeating. Quote, "Success is never owned, it's only rented, and the rent is due every day." Episode 24, Dr. Kirk Parsley. Wow. This episode was loaded full of really important and really powerful information, and I owe a lot of my knowledge about sleep to Dr. Parsley and his work. There's too much to list that came out of this episode. How to diagnose your sleep, how to sleep better, how napping helps you learn better, how to optimize cognitive performance, and much, much more. My biggest learning point here, though, was Dr. Parsley's explanation of the sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system and how heart rate variability is an incredibly accurate measurement for how you'll perform at just about anything. Fascinating. Episode 25, Gretchen Rubin. I bonded with Gretchen in a really big way, and I absolutely love her and her work. For me, there were too many takeaways to list. The importance of selecting a guru, the 4 different personality types and how they affect habit change, and some key insights on happiness. Probably one of my favorite takeaways from Gretchen comes from her book, actually, which I read after interviewing her. It's the idea of having a list of, quote, secrets of adulthood, things that you discovered only as an adult. I've been keeping my own list since reading, and I can't wait to share it with you guys very soon. Episode 26, Ben Greenfield. Ben is someone whose work I admire very much, and I really enjoyed getting an insight into his unique approach to biohacking. More specifically, he was one of the first guests to open my eyes to the fact that there are no hard and fast rules, that because of biokinetic individuality, there is some variance in what will work and for whom. Though some things seem to be unwaveringly true no matter how many guests we interview, for example, eating lots of fresh vegetables and cutting out processed foods, I think it's important to remember that there is some variance between people. Another lasting impact Ben left was the idea of fasting 12 hours every single day, for example, skipping breakfast. This goes against so much of what we've been told, but I've implemented it in my own life with great success. Episode 27, Chris Bailey. Chris and I really hit it off and have become buddies since this interview. Chris was one of the first people to help me view meditation not just as an emotional and mental health tool, but also as a productivity strategy. I also really enjoyed his self-compassionate approach to simply dropping what didn't feel right, like waking up at 5:30 in the morning. I also learned that there are 7 criteria to make a task more susceptible to procrastination, and that our brains think in 3s. Episode 28, Harry Lorraine. Just the fact that I was able to interview one of the greats like Harry was an incredible honor. Admittedly, Harry's approach is a bit old school. He doesn't believe that diet or supplementation can improve memory, and he vehemently rejects the validity of the memory palace technique that is used by all the world's champions and record holders. With that said, he and his incredible career demonstrate just how much you can improve your memory simply using basic visual memory techniques. Episode 29, Hal Elrod. Hal is another guest who is really good about creating easy-to-understand frameworks and memorable quotes. Though I have to admit I have yet to try his miracle morning routine, I still took away a lot from this episode. One of my biggest takeaways of the last 2 years was the idea that if I want to have certain results or outcomes in my life, it's not about changing behaviors or attitudes. It's about fully becoming the type of person who achieves those outcomes, i.e. reinventing yourself. Now, I've heard it many times since, but I learned it from Hal and a couple other guests. Episode 30, Brad Pilon. In this episode, we went deep into the idea of intermittent fasting, fasts that range from 18 to 24 hours. A few big takeaways came from this episode. One was just how the fitness and supplementation industry works and the constraints that they're operating under. Number 2 was obviously the massive benefit of intermittent fasting, which I've implemented into my own life. And number 3 was that this episode made me abandon my aspiration for improved ab definition. As Brad informed me, keeping your body fat as low as fitness models is not only damn near impossible on a part-time basis, but it's also bloody miserable. Episode 31, Ari Meisel. I've been a productivity enthusiast for years, and yet my episode with Ari Meisel really opened my eyes. It helped me realize that you actually can accomplish incredible things simply by working 2 days a week. It renewed my faith in outsourcing, which was one of the reasons I hired a few more people to help me manage this company. I also realized that a lot of the work I was doing was just to make me feel busy. Over the last few months, I've worked between 10 and 25 hours a week, and I know that this episode with Ari is in part to thank. Episode 32, John Lee Dumas. It's simply incredible what John has been able to do. I guess the biggest takeaway from this episode was just how much more I could be doing. If it weren't for John, I definitely would not have built my masterclass. Furthermore, he's the one who pushed me to do webinars, which are currently helping me grow my business. Ultimately, however, John has just been a huge inspiration for me as a solopreneur, showing me just how much you can help others, earn a killer living, and find fulfillment all without sacrificing your quality of life. Episode 33, Shane Stott. In this episode, we revisited an interesting biohack that I employed a lot in high school, sensory deprivation. Though I still haven't found an affordable tank for rent here in Israel, the episode still provided me a ton of value. I learned about the efficacy of transdermal magnesium absorption and also was exposed to the idea that floating is basically meditation made easier. Episode 34, Dr. Anthony Metivier, Part 2. If you guys remember, this was the 2-part mega episode where Anthony and I drank a bottle of wine each and answered questions in a live broadcast. The biggest and most lasting result of that episode, it was the last time I had a drink. But beyond a life-changing hangover, Anthony and I covered a ton of topics over the course of 2 hours, way too much to summarize in a few sentences. I guess one of the biggest takeaways, if I had to pick one, is the idea of digging your wells before you are thirsty, i.e., plan ahead. Episode 33, Abel James. In this episode, I was exposed for one of the first times to the idea of a high-fat diet. Though I knew all about paleo, I still think I was stuck in the thought that you shouldn't eat too much fat. Abel definitely set me straight, and from then on, I consumed much higher proportions of fat in my diet with great success. The rest of the advice he gave has been repeated by every guest. Eat more vegetables, cut out processed crap. But one thing he said really stuck with me, and that's the idea of a holistic approach to lifestyle. It's not just diet that's making us sick, it's our entire environment, and we can change it. Episode 36, Nick Littlehales. I have to say that I've always been pretty interested in sleep as an area for improved performance, and after talking with Kirk Parsley, I thought I knew it all. I was wrong. Nick blew my mind, opening it up to the whole world of deliberately redesigning your sleep environment. We talked pillows, we talked sheets, we talked beds, and how to know what your body needs. This episode was the most expensive one to produce, namely because I've spent thousands of dollars improving my sleep environment based on Nick's suggestion, but it was well worth it. Episode 37, Anna and Lev Golden Touch, Part 2. In this episode, we dove into the idea of how you can apply accelerated learning techniques to raising your children. Though I unfortunately don't yet have children, I learned a lot in the episode about how to interact with children in a way that maximizes their learning. Ultimately, my big takeaway was that it's more about the interaction style than it is about giving lectures or sharing tools, and I can't wait to put all that into practice one day. Episode 38, Rob Wolf. This was an exciting opportunity to interview one of my heroes, and he definitely did not disappoint. Though we covered all things paleo, truthfully, a lot of that was not new information to me. What was, however, was learning how Rob's opinions have changed and how he's relaxed his guidelines since originally publishing his blockbuster book. Rob helped clarify a lot of things that were still question marks for me, like hummus and dairy and sweeteners and cheat days, and for that reason, I think it was one of our best ever episodes. Episode 39, Chris Carr. I came into this episode expecting to learn how Chris used diet and nutrition to survive cancer. Instead, my big takeaways were really just the power of mindset. Chris's incredible positivity and control over her emotional state were so apparent, I started to realize just how much it influences her physical health and that of all of us. Chris and I both agreed on a really beautiful point towards the end of the interview that it is not okay to not take care of yourself. Episode 40, Dr. Tammy Miraglia. After Ben Greenfield mentioned hormones and how chemicals around us influence them, I was eager to get an expert on the show to clear that up for us. Dr. Tammy was just that. She helped me understand just how harmful many of the, quote, safe chemicals in our products are, a topic that I went on to research much, much further. This interview with Dr. Tammy was the deciding factor that led me to creating an entire online course on testosterone optimization, and I referred to her work during the research and development quite a bit. Episode 41, Dr. Lauren Cordain. In this episode, we went into a deep dive of the paleo diet and how it was discovered. Whereas Rob Wolf made the case for more flexibility, Dr. Cordain presented the opposite view. There were a lot of big takeaways here about our living environments, supplementation, and more, but perhaps the one thing that stuck with me most is the idea that we should never have gotten to such an overpopulated number if we'd remained on our natural paleo diet, for better or worse. Episode 42, Timothy Moser. I enjoyed talking to Timothy so much, partly because we share the same two passions and vocations, productivity and mnemonics. Tim and I agree on so much, but nonetheless, I did learn something really cool from him during the episode. An innovative way to organize language learning memory palaces to blast through grammatical challenges. I wish I'd started learning Russian the way that Timothy teaches Spanish. It would have saved me so much time and effort. Episode 43, Michelle Tam. Michelle Tam was the third of our three-part series on paleo, and the goal of the episode was to give people some practical strategies and recipes to implement paleo in their own lives. Thanks to this episode, I discovered the incredible health benefits of bone broth and began regularly making it, and also I discovered Michelle's incredible recipe for crackling chicken, and it has definitely become one of my staples. Episode 44, Kamal Patel. In this episode, I learned just how misleading scientific studies can be and why it's important to have unbiased and professionally trained third parties review and summarize scientific research. Perhaps most troubling was the realization that after years of working to review tens of thousands of studies, Kamal has found that the vast majority of supplements out there simply don't work. Episode 45, Derek Sivers. I love Derek Sivers. His incredible energy and enthusiasm were absolutely contagious and have stuck with me since. Derek and I have so much in common and even share the same favorite fable, and yet I actually learned a lot during this episode. The biggest idea I took away was just that helping people and giving them advice can be a form of public service. I always aspired to dedicate a portion of my time to charity, and Derek helped me realize that I don't have to volunteer at a soup kitchen to do so. Since then, I've done many more Facebook Live broadcasts and invested more time in responding to people's email requests as a form of charitable effort alongside this podcast. And Derek's right. It feels great. Episode 46, Daniel T. Willingham. I always love the opportunity to put what I know about learning up against scientific research, and in this episode, I did just that. While it was nice to reconfirm that research still supports so much of what we teach in our accelerated learning courses, most interesting were the things that I quite honestly didn't know until speaking with Daniel. After speaking with him, I made numerous improvements to my own courses, including explanations of how to space studying out properly and how to avoid fooling yourself into thinking you've actually learned something. Episode 47, Murdoch Kalehi. In this episode on advanced blood testing, we clarified a lot of things. For example, LDL versus HDL cholesterol, hemoglobin H1C, omega-3 versus omega-6, and much, much more. But none of that is what stuck in my head. Instead, my biggest takeaways were the idea that preventative medicine, for example, blood testing and proper supplementation, is so much more cost-effective than reactive medicine. I also learned that blood testing should be done much more often than most people do it, as much as 4 times per year. Episode 48, Dr. Vivienne Ming. In this fascinating episode with a true superwoman, I learned some very interesting takeaways. For example, what factors actually predict success and intelligence? How much is fixed and how much is flexible? And above all, what medical breakthroughs in neuroscience are going to completely change the face of humanity? Ultimately, the lasting impression for me of this episode was Dr. Ming's insistence that we can drastically alter outcomes and even intelligence using technology at every level. Episode 49, William Davis, MD. Obviously, I was not the least bit surprised that grains present a whole slew of health risks. What I did learn, however, was that lipid testing, for example, getting your cholesterol tested, is really one big farce. I also learned about phytates and lectins and why they present health risks even greater than those of gluten. Ultimately, this episode just further reinforced my belief that the paleo diet is the way to go. Episode 50, Chris Bailey, Part 2. I so enjoyed my first episode with Chris that I was very eager to have him back to talk about his much anticipated book. This episode was incredible, and it opened my eyes to a number of new ideas like biological prime time, restricting your access to technology, and much, much more. This episode changed my daily life in two ways. One, I've meditated with a stopwatch, not a timer, every day since. And two, I've turned off the majority of notifications on my devices and regularly practice setting boundaries for technology. So that's a summary of the first 50 episodes and what I took away from them. In the next episode, I'm going to cover the next 50 episodes that we discussed. I'm going to share with you guys my top 10 episodes. I'm going to share with you the top 10 books. And I'm also going to summarize my biggest takeaways from doing all of these episodes. I'm going to draw together all the different things that these top performers do that you can learn from. So that episode is being released at the exact same time as this episode. So go ahead and give it a listen. I'll catch you guys over there in just a second. All right, super friends, that's it for this week's episode. We hope you really enjoyed it and learned a ton of applicable stuff that can help you go out there and overcome the impossible. If so, please do us a favor and leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher or however you found this podcast. In addition to that, we are always looking for great guest posts on the blog or awesome guests right here on the podcast. So if you know somebody or you are somebody or you have thought of somebody who would be a great fit for the show or for our blog, please reach out to us either on Twitter or by email. Our email is info@becomingasuperhuman.com. Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Becoming Superhuman Podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit www.becomingasuperhuman.com/podcast. We'll see you next time.